It was in the autumn of 1893 that London first began to whisper of the illness. At first the rumors were faint, little more than uneasy conversations carried through the fog that settled nightly over the city. A clerk who collapsed in his office, a physician found dead beside his desk, a chemist discovered alone in his laboratory before sunrise. Each death was quietly recorded under the same explanation: influenza. Yet to my friend Sherlock Holmes, the pattern behind those deaths appeared almost immediately, and once seen, it could not easily be ignored. The fog that season was unusually thick, a pale yellow mist that drifted through the narrow streets of London from dawn until late evening. It softened the glow of the gas lamps and muffled the ceaseless clatter of carriage wheels along Baker Street. But the true uneasiness of those days did not come from the fog itself. It came from the quiet rumor of illness spreading invisibly through the city. Hospitals reported wards filling faster than physicians could attend them, while the morning newspapers carried columns of obituaries that lengthened with unsettling regularity. Some doctors described fevers rising with alarming speed. Others spoke of patients collapsing without warning in the midst of ordinary activity. For most citizens, these reports were merely disturbing. For those of us residing at 221B Baker Street, they soon became something far more troubling. Holmes had grown unusually silent during those days. While I attended my medical rounds and observed the growing anxiety among patients, Holmes remained seated beside the sitting-room window, long fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied the morning newspapers with intense concentration. More than once, I observed him marking small circles around certain death notices before quietly cutting them from the page and placing them into a growing stack upon the table. "You perceive something unusual in these reports," I remarked one evening as the wind rattled the windows and the fire burned low. Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he rose and crossed the room, selecting 3 clippings which he laid before me in a careful row. "You will observe, Watson," he said quietly, "that each death occurred indoors, each victim was alone, and each physician attributed the cause to influenza." I examined the brief reports. "And yet you believe something is wrong?" Holmes tapped one column with a slender finger. "Observe the final detail," he said. I read the line again. Witnesses had described the same curious expression upon the victims' faces. Terror. Several accounts mention it, Holmes continued. "The victim appears to have seen something in the final moment, something wholly unexpected." "A fever might produce delirium," I suggested. Holmes shook his head slowly. "Disease, my dear Watson, may strike swiftly, but it rarely arranges its victims with mathematical neatness." He turned toward the wall where he had drawn a small map of London upon a sheet of paper. Dark pencil marks indicated the locations of several recent deaths. When I stepped closer, I noticed that the marks formed a loose cluster surrounding a very familiar address, Baker Street itself. "Surely coincidence," I murmured. Holmes regarded the map in silence for several seconds. "Coincidence is possible," he admitted at last. "Yet when coincidence appears repeatedly within the same narrow radius, a prudent observer must consider the possibility of design." Outside the window, the fog thickened, swallowing the gaslight and leaving the street in a dim amber glow. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattled past, followed by the hurried footsteps of a messenger boy delivering yet another evening edition filled with anxious speculation. London had endured epidemics before, but something about this one troubled Holmes deeply. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the drifting mist as though it concealed an answer just beyond sight. "If I am correct, Watson," he said quietly, "this epidemic is not merely a matter of disease." He paused. "Something moves within it, something deliberate and exceedingly patient." A faint chill passed through me then, for I recognized the tone in Holmes's voice. It was the calm certainty that always preceded one of his most dangerous investigations. At that moment, neither of us could have imagined how deeply the mystery would soon reach into London's frightened heart, nor how many deaths attributed to illness would ultimately prove to be something far more sinister. It was 2 mornings after Holmes first expressed his unease that the case, which had until then existed only as a pattern upon a newspaper map, stepped suddenly into our immediate sphere. I had just finished breakfast when a sharp knock sounded below, followed by the hurried footsteps of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. "A constable to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her expression betraying the same anxious tension that had lately gripped much of London. "He says the matter is urgent." Holmes, who had been languidly examining a chemical monograph beside the fireplace, rose with quiet interest. When the young constable entered, his cap clutched tightly in both hands, it was immediately clear that whatever business brought him was no routine errand. "Mr. Holmes," he said, slightly breathless, "Inspector Bradstreet sends his compliments. There has been a death not 50 yards from here. He believes the circumstances may interest you." Holmes's grey eyes brightened faintly. "Indeed? And what form does this interest take?" "The deceased was a chemist, sir, Mr. Theodore Blackwood, found dead in his laboratory early this morning." Holmes gestured calmly toward the door. "Watson, your coat, if you please. Let us see whether Mr. Blackwood's misfortune has any bearing upon the peculiar statistics we were examining yesterday." The chemist's establishment stood just beyond the corner of Baker Street, its modest shop front shuttered against the morning fog. A small crowd had gathered outside, speaking in hushed tones while two constables kept the doorway clear. Inspector Bradstreet himself greeted us inside with visible relief. "Holmes, I'm glad you've come," he said gravely. "I can't make sense of this one." We were led up a narrow staircase into the laboratory above the shop. The room was a curious mixture of order and chaos. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with bottles, powders, and glass instruments that glinted faintly in the pale morning light. The air carried a sharp chemical scent that made my throat tighten, yet it was the figure at the workbench that held the eye. Theodore Blackwood sat slumped forward in his chair, one hand still resting upon a glass stirring rod, as though interrupted in the midst of some experiment. His features were rigid with an expression so vivid that I involuntarily halted several steps from the body. It was not pain that marked his face. It was terror. Holmes approached slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. Without touching the body, he studied every detail with intense concentration. "No sign of violence?" he asked quietly. "None," Bradstreet replied. "Door locked from the inside. Window latched. His assistant had to force the door when Blackwood failed to answer." Holmes bent slightly, bringing his face closer to the chemist's mouth and nose. He inhaled once, very faintly, and then straightened. "Curious," he murmured. "I conducted a brief examination myself. The skin bore a faint bluish discoloration. A trace of foam lingered at the corners of the mouth. There were no wounds, no burns, no visible poisons upon the table." "Influenza," Bradstreet said grimly. "Dr. Farnsworth believes the man succumbed suddenly while working." Holmes's brows rose slightly. "Does influenza commonly strike with such dramatic swiftness, Watson?" I hesitated. "It can be severe, certainly, but this expression is unusual." Holmes circled the workbench slowly, eyes sweeping the laboratory with meticulous attention. His gaze paused upon several sealed beakers arranged near a small spirit lamp. "What was Blackwood studying?" he asked. "Treatments for the epidemic," Bradstreet replied. The man had grown rather obsessed with finding a cure. Holmes leaned closer to the beakers, studying them through his magnifying lens. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he glanced toward the window. Outside, the fog pressed thickly against the glass, turning the world beyond into a blurred yellow haze. "A most interesting coincidence," Holmes said quietly. Bradstreet frowned. "Coincidence?" Holmes gestured toward the body. "A chemist researching the epidemic dies suddenly while locked inside his own laboratory. His symptoms resemble the disease he hoped to cure, yet his expression suggests a far more violent encounter." Holmes's gaze shifted once more across the room, lingering upon the shelves of chemicals with growing intensity. "My dear Watson," he said softly, "I begin to suspect that Mr. Blackwood did not die of influenza at all." Bradstreet stared at him. "Then what killed him?" Holmes folded his hands behind his back, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "That, Inspector, is precisely the question we must answer before this epidemic claims another victim." For even in that moment, as we stood within the silent laboratory, I sensed that the chemist's death was no isolated tragedy. It was merely the first visible thread of a far more dangerous mystery slowly tightening around Baker Street itself. Inspector Bradstreet had stationed 2 constables outside the laboratory door to ensure that no curious visitor disturbed the room before its secrets could be understood. Holmes appeared quietly pleased by this precaution, for it allowed him to conduct his examination with the unhurried patience that was the hallmark of his method. The laboratory itself was a narrow chamber whose walls were crowded with shelves holding an extraordinary variety of chemical apparatus. Bottles of every conceivable size stood in precise rows, each bearing neatly written labels in the careful hand of the deceased chemist. Retorts, flasks, spirit lamps, and glass tubing occupied the workbench, while a ledger bound in red leather lay open beside several sealed beakers containing colorless liquid. Holmes moved through this environment like a man studying the scene of a chess match rather than a death. His eyes lingered upon details that seemed utterly insignificant to me. The faint residue around a cork stopper, the exact angle at which a glass rod rested upon the bench, the thin layer of dust undisturbed along the windowsill. Bradstreet watched him with growing impatience. "You see something already?" the inspector asked. Holmes did not immediately reply. Instead, he withdrew his magnifying lens and bent closer to the workbench. His fingers hovered above the surface but did not touch it. "Tell me, Inspector," he said at last, "when the assistant forced the door, was the room exactly as we see it now?" "Yes. Nothing has been moved." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Then the position of the body is most instructive." I stepped nearer, following the direction of his gaze. Blackwood's right hand still gripped the slender glass stirring rod so tightly that the knuckles had retained their pale tension even in death. His other hand rested against his chest, fingers slightly curved as though instinctively recoiling from some unseen presence. "You observe the posture, Watson?" Holmes asked quietly. "He appears to have been working when death struck." "Precisely. Yet observe the expression. Terror rather than confusion. Something startled him profoundly in the final instant." Holmes straightened and turned his attention toward the row of beakers arranged beside the spirit lamp. Each vessel contained a small amount of clear liquid, and their glass stoppers were sealed with careful precision. Holmes lifted one gently, holding it toward the light streaming through the fogged window. "Blackwood was clearly engaged in a series of chemical trials," he said. "Note the uniform arrangement of these samples. This was no casual experiment." Bradstreet shrugged. He was developing medicines for the epidemic. Holmes tilted the beaker slightly, studying the interior surface with unusual interest. "And yet," he murmured, "these samples appear recently prepared. The condensation on the glass suggests the compound inside possesses a volatile character." I leaned forward, catching a faint scent rising from the workbench. There was a subtle sweetness in the air, almost pleasant at first, though beneath it lay a sharper odor that produced a slight sting in the throat. Holmes detected it at once. "Ah," he said softly. Bradstreet frowned. "What is it?" Holmes replaced the beaker carefully upon the table. "Merely an observation, Inspector. Our unfortunate chemist appears to have been working with a compound that produces vapor even at room temperature. That's common enough in chemical work." "True," Holmes replied, "but not usually in sealed laboratories where the ventilation is so limited." He walked slowly toward the window and examined the latch. The brass fastening was secured firmly from the inside, and a fine line of dust remained undisturbed along the sill. "No recent opening," Holmes noted. He then turned his attention to the door. The wood around the lock bore clear splinter marks where the assistant had forced entry earlier that morning. Holmes studied these marks for several seconds before nodding to himself. "The room was indeed sealed," he said. Bradstreet crossed his arms. "You're suggesting murder again." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his gaze drifting back toward the body. "Let us consider the facts," he said calmly. "A chemist researching the epidemic dies suddenly while alone in a locked laboratory. His posture suggests he remained conscious until the final moment. His expression reveals extreme terror." Holmes gestured lightly toward the beakers, "And within arm's reach, we find chemical experiments involving compounds capable of producing vapor." Bradstreet's expression hardened. "You think he poisoned himself by accident?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "Perhaps, yet accidents seldom produce such a look upon the face." He stepped closer to the workbench once more and leaned down, inhaling faintly near one of the glass containers. When he rose again, his eyes had taken on that distant analytical brightness which I had learned to recognize as the first sign that Holmes's formidable intellect had begun assembling its conclusions. "My dear Watson," he said quietly, "I believe our unfortunate chemist may have encountered a substance far more dangerous than he realized." "You mean one of his experiments turned lethal?" Holmes's gaze shifted toward the fog-covered window, where the muted light gave the laboratory an almost spectral glow. "Possibly," he replied, "but there remains a more troubling alternative." Bradstreet leaned forward. "And that is—" Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "That someone else may have understood the properties of this compound rather better than Mr. Blackwood himself." The inspector's eyes narrowed. "You're saying the epidemic might not be the only thing killing people in London?" Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Inspector, I begin to suspect that what appears to be a disease spreading through Baker Street may in fact conceal a far more deliberate agency." The words hung heavily in the still laboratory air. Outside, the fog pressed silently against the glass, as though the city itself were holding its breath, while the truth of Blackwood's death slowly began to take shape before us. When Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that afternoon, the fog had thickened into a dense yellow veil that hung low across the rooftops. The city seemed curiously subdued beneath it. Even the usual clatter of hansom cabs and street vendors had softened, as though London itself were uneasy under the invisible weight of the epidemic that now dominated every conversation. Holmes removed his coat without a word and moved directly to the table beside the window, where the stack of newspaper clippings he had been collecting over the past several days lay arranged with unusual precision. The moment we entered the room, he resumed the quiet ritual I had observed earlier that week, sorting, rereading, and annotating the small reports of illness and death scattered throughout the columns. I stood for several minutes watching him in silence. "You believe Blackwood's death belongs among these notices?" I said at last. Holmes did not look up. "On the contrary, Watson," he replied calmly. "I believe these notices belong to Blackwood." He selected 3 clippings and laid them side by side upon the table. "All published within the last 10 days, he continued, "all attributed to influenza, all occurring within a mile of Baker Street." I leaned closer to read the brief reports. The first described the sudden death of a solicitor discovered alone in his office late at night. The second concerned a retired physician found collapsed beside his writing desk. The third detailed the passing of a chemist's assistant in Marylebone, whose neighbors reported hearing a chair overturned shortly before midnight. Each article concluded with the same simple explanation: influenza. Holmes tapped the page with his forefinger. "Do you notice the similarity of language?" I read the passages again more carefully. "They all mention the same expression," I said slowly. "Witnesses describing the victims' faces as startled." Holmes nodded. Startled, alarmed, terrified. The exact word varies, but the sentiment remains constant. He rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he had pinned a sheet of paper bearing the small map of London he had drawn the previous evening. Several dark pencil marks clustered across the streets surrounding Baker Street itself. "This," he said, gesturing toward the map, "is where coincidence becomes less persuasive." I studied the marks. "They are close together," I admitted. "Exceedingly close," Holmes replied. 4 deaths within a remarkably confined radius. Yet the victims appear unrelated. Different professions, different households, different ages. He turned back toward the table, selecting another clipping from the growing pile. "But each death shares 3 remarkable features." Holmes counted them off upon his fingers. "First, sudden collapse indoors while alone. Second, no visible injury or poison. Third, an expression of intense fear observed upon the face." I folded my arms thoughtfully. "That might still be the result of fever or delirium." Holmes smiled faintly. "An admirable medical hypothesis, Watson. Yet allow me to add a 4th feature." He handed me the newest clipping. The brief article reported the death of a small pharmaceutical manufacturer only 3 streets from Baker Street. According to the report, the man had been found late at night in his private office, his door locked from within. I felt a faint chill. That is remarkably similar to Blackwood's death. Exactly, Holmes said. He returned to the map and placed another pencil mark upon the paper. Now the cluster appeared even tighter, forming an irregular ring around our own street. For several seconds, Holmes studied the pattern in silence. The epidemic itself may be genuine, he said slowly, yet these particular deaths possess characteristics which do not align comfortably with disease. He walked back to the table and picked up the small vial he had collected from Blackwood's laboratory earlier that day. Even through the glass stopper, the faint, sweet odor remained detectable. "A volatile compound," Holmes murmured, "capable of dispersing silently through the air." "Holmes," I said suddenly, "you cannot be suggesting that someone is poisoning these victims." He set the vial down carefully. "Not poisoning them in the conventional sense." "Then how?" Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the dim light. "Imagine, Watson, a substance that produces a vapor invisible to the eye, a compound whose effects mimic the symptoms of disease, a compound which, if administered carefully, would leave no trace obvious to the hurried physician already overwhelmed by epidemic cases." The idea seemed almost too grotesque to consider. "You mean someone could commit murder while the city believes the victims died of influenza?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Precisely." Outside, the fog pressed thickly against the window pane, transforming the gaslight into dim yellow halos along the street. Holmes stood watching it thoughtfully. "If that hypothesis proves correct," he said quietly, "then the epidemic spreading through Baker Street may conceal something far more dangerous than illness." He turned back toward the map. "For every pattern eventually reveals the presence of an intelligence behind it." His gaze lingered on the tight cluster of pencil marks surrounding our street. "And I fear we are only just beginning to glimpse the shape of that design." It was scarcely 48 hours after the death of Mr. Theodore Blackwood that the uneasy suspicions which Holmes had begun to entertain were transformed into something far more troubling. I had just returned from a round of medical visits late in the afternoon when I found Holmes standing at the sitting room window with the peculiar stillness that always signaled intense mental activity. The evening edition of the Daily Telegraph lay open upon the table beside him. Without turning, he said quietly, "Another." I removed my coat slowly. "Another what?" "Another death attributed to influenza." There was something in his tone that made the ordinary explanation seem suddenly insufficient. Holmes handed me the newspaper, his long finger resting upon a small column halfway down the page. I read the notice aloud. "Dr. Edmund Wright, a respected physician residing near Marylebone Road, was discovered deceased in his consulting room earlier this morning. The attending physician attributes the cause to complications arising from the current influenza epidemic." Holmes said nothing for several seconds. Then he turned toward me with an expression that was both grave and faintly triumphant. "You see the difficulty, Watson. I see only another unfortunate victim of the epidemic. Look more closely." I examined the article again. "The door was locked from the inside," I said slowly. "Precisely." The short report continued with a brief statement from the doctor's housekeeper, who had discovered the body after receiving no answer to her morning knock. She had found her employer seated behind his desk, his teacup untouched beside him. I lowered the paper. "That is certainly similar to Blackwood's death." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "It is identical in several respects." Before I could reply, the sharp knock of a cab door echoed from the street below. A moment later, hurried footsteps sounded upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson opened the door with visible concern. "Inspector Bradstreet to see you, Mr. Holmes." The inspector entered quickly, his face flushed from the cold evening air. "I thought you'd want to hear this at once," he said. "Another one." Holmes gestured calmly toward the chair opposite him. "Dr. Edmund Wright, I presume." Bradstreet blinked in surprise. "You already know." Holmes smiled faintly. "The newspapers travel quickly, Inspector. Tell me, did the physician die alone in his consulting room?" "Yes." "And the door was secured?" "Locked from the inside." Holmes folded his hands thoughtfully. And his expression? Bradstreet hesitated before answering. Unpleasant. In what way? Frightened, the inspector admitted. The housekeeper said it looked as though the man had seen something terrible just before he died. Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. You see, Watson? Bradstreet frowned. See what? Holmes rose and paced slowly across the carpet. Mr. Blackwood was a chemist conducting research related to the epidemic. Dr. Wright was a physician practicing medicine within the same district. Both died suddenly while alone. Both rooms were sealed. Both displayed identical symptoms. Bradstreet's expression darkened. You think these deaths are connected? I do more than think it. Holmes stopped beside the fireplace. Tell me, Inspector, did Dr. Wright have any professional connection to Blackwood? Bradstreet nodded slowly. As a matter of fact, yes. They both served on a small advisory committee studying the epidemic. Holmes's face sharpened instantly. Indeed, Blackwood was examining chemical treatments. Wright was helping gather medical data. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back, his posture suddenly alert. My dear Watson, he said quietly, the matter grows clearer by the moment. Bradstreet leaned forward. Clearer how? Holmes turned toward the inspector. When two men engaged in the same investigation die under identical circumstances within days of one another, coincidence becomes rather unlikely. The inspector rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You're saying someone killed them. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window where the fog had begun to thicken again along Baker Street. I'm saying that two investigators studying the epidemic have now died of the epidemic itself. Bradstreet exhaled slowly. That does look suspicious. Holmes nodded, particularly when the method of death appears remarkably difficult to detect. I felt a sudden uneasiness. You believe they discovered something? Holmes turned toward me. Yes, Watson. What? Holmes's voice dropped slightly. I believe they discovered that the epidemic may not be responsible for all the deaths attributed to it. Bradstreet's eyes widened. You mean someone is using the epidemic as cover? Holmes inclined his head. A most convenient cover, Inspector. In a city already overwhelmed by illness, who would question an additional death? Silence settled briefly over the room. Outside, a carriage rolled slowly past through the fog. Bradstreet spoke first. What do we do? Holmes's expression hardened into that calm determination which always preceded the unfolding of one of his most dangerous investigations. We discover what Wright and Blackwood were investigating. And if they were murdered, Holmes's eyes flashed faintly, then we must assume their killer has already chosen the next victim. The implication hung heavily in the room. For the first time since the epidemic had begun, the mystery no longer felt distant or abstract. It had drawn dangerously close to Baker Street itself. The death of Dr. Edmund Wright transformed Holmes's suspicions from an interesting theory into a matter of urgent concern. That evening, the sitting room at Baker Street took on the atmosphere of a war room rather than the comfortable refuge it had so often been. Papers covered the table. Chemical notes lay scattered beside Blackwood's laboratory samples, and Holmes himself moved about the room with restless concentration. I sat opposite him with a medical journal in hand, though I confess I read very little of it. My thoughts remained fixed upon the two men who had died so suddenly within days of one another. Holmes, I said at last, if these deaths are indeed connected, we must determine the cause with certainty. Influenza can produce many alarming symptoms. Holmes stopped beside the fireplace. Yes, Watson, but it cannot do one particular thing. And what is that? It cannot create identical circumstances across multiple deaths unless those deaths are connected by design. He lifted the small glass vial he had taken from Blackwood's laboratory earlier that day. The faint, sweet odor drifted again into the room. Holmes held it toward the lamplight. This compound intrigues me, he said quietly. You believe Blackwood created it? Possibly. Or at the very least he was studying it. I leaned forward. It smells somewhat like ether. Holmes nodded. An excellent observation. Yet there is something else beneath it. Something sharper. He removed the stopper briefly and allowed a small amount of vapor to escape before replacing it carefully. Volatile, he murmured. You mean it evaporates easily? Precisely, Holmes set the vial down again. "Now consider the circumstances surrounding both deaths." He began pacing slowly across the carpet. Each victim died indoors while alone. Each room was sealed. Each body displayed signs consistent with sudden asphyxiation rather than prolonged illness, which might still resemble influenza to an inattentive physician. Holmes turned toward me with approval. "Exactly." I felt a growing unease. "You believe the killer is using chemicals?" Holmes folded his arms thoughtfully. "Imagine a substance capable of releasing a toxic vapor when heated or exposed to air, a substance that produces confusion, terror, and respiratory failure within minutes, and which leaves little trace once dispersed." Holmes smiled faintly. "You begin to see the elegance of the method." The idea chilled me more than any London fog. Such a weapon would be nearly impossible to detect. Holmes nodded, particularly during an epidemic where physicians already expect to encounter respiratory distress. I considered the scene in Blackwood's laboratory again. The chemist might have recognized the compound, which would explain the expression of terror, Holmes said quietly. He paused beside the map pinned upon the wall. "And Dr. Wright? He may have encountered the same vapor." Holmes tapped one of the pencil marks on the map. "In his consulting room, perhaps through an apparently harmless object." "What sort of object?" Holmes's gaze drifted toward the teapot sitting upon our own table. "Tea." I stared at him. "You cannot mean," Holmes continued calmly. "A volatile compound placed within hot liquid would release vapor almost immediately. The victim inhales it while drinking." The simplicity of the method was horrifying. "And no one would suspect murder," I said slowly. "Quite so." Holmes resumed pacing. "A killer using such a substance could strike repeatedly without leaving evidence obvious to the casual observer." "Holmes," I said suddenly, "if this is true, then the epidemic might conceal dozens of such crimes." Holmes's expression darkened. "That possibility has occurred to me as well." He moved to the window and gazed out into the dim fog covering Baker Street. The lamps along the street appeared as faint yellow circles in the mist. "London at present is the perfect environment for such a scheme," he continued thoughtfully. "Physicians are overwhelmed. Deaths occur daily, records are rushed, patterns remain unnoticed, and the killer operates unseen." Holmes nodded slowly. "An invisible weapon carried by invisible vapor." For several moments neither of us spoke. At last I broke the silence. "Then Blackwood and Wright were not random victims." Holmes turned toward me. "No, they were targets." "Precisely. But why?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. "That, Watson, is the most intriguing question of all." He walked back to the table and examined Blackwood's laboratory notes once more. "These men were studying the epidemic itself. You think they discovered something?" Holmes tapped the ledger thoughtfully. "Perhaps they discovered that certain deaths attributed to influenza were not caused by disease at all. The implication struck me at once. If they uncovered a pattern," Holmes finished the thought quietly, "then the man responsible for that pattern would have every reason to silence them." A faint shiver ran down my spine. "How many victims might there be?" Holmes returned to the map and studied the cluster of marks surrounding Baker Street. "For the moment we know only 2. He added a third small circle to the map. "But I suspect we shall soon discover that the epidemic hides a far darker arithmetic." Holmes stepped back and regarded the map with grave concentration. "And if my reasoning proves correct, Watson, we are dealing not merely with a murderer but with a criminal who has discovered the perfect disguise for his crimes." Outside, the fog thickened again across London, carrying with it the quiet dread of illness. Yet I knew that somewhere, within that same mist, walked a far more dangerous presence, one who used the city's fear of disease as the perfect cover for death. The following morning found Holmes already at work long before the city had fully awakened. When I descended from my room shortly after 7, I discovered the sitting room transformed into something resembling a small archive. Letters, medical reports, newspaper clippings, and several official registries were spread across the table in orderly stacks. Holmes himself sat amid the papers with a notebook open before him, his expression one of intense concentration. "You are early at your labors today, Holmes," I remarked. He looked up briefly, though the restless energy in his eyes suggested he had slept very little. "My dear Watson," he replied, "when two investigators die while examining the same phenomenon, it becomes essential to determine precisely what they were investigating." He pushed a sheet of notes across the table toward me. "I spent several hours last night reviewing the professional records of both Mr. Blackwood and Dr. Wright. And did you discover anything?" Holmes rose and began pacing slowly across the room, his familiar method of organizing thought through motion. "Quite a great deal, in fact." He paused beside the fireplace and consulted his notebook. Blackwood was conducting chemical research into potential treatments for influenza, particularly compounds designed to neutralize airborne contagion. "That seems entirely reasonable." Holmes nodded. "Yes. However, Dr. Wright's work was somewhat different." "How so?" "He was compiling statistical reports on the spread of the epidemic throughout several London districts." Holmes walked to the wall where the map of Baker Street and its surrounding neighborhoods still hung. He had begun to notice irregularities in the distribution of cases. I leaned forward with interest. "Meaning the disease did not spread as expected?" "Precisely." Holmes tapped several marks on the map. "A genuine epidemic tends to spread outward through contact and proximity. The pattern is usually irregular but continuous." He then pointed to the cluster of deaths we had already marked. "These cases appear instead as isolated points, individual deaths scattered across the district without the surrounding wave of illness one would expect. You believe they were not infected at all?" Holmes smiled faintly. "That is precisely the conclusion Dr. Wright appears to have reached." He returned to the table and lifted a folded document. "This is a copy of the Advisory Committee records for the Metropolitan Asylum Board, the committee that Blackwood and Wright served on." "Yes." Holmes handed me the document. The list contained several names of physicians, chemists, and medical officials responsible for studying the epidemic. I scanned it carefully. "Both men appear here." "Indeed they do." Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully. "But what interests me most is the committee's final report submitted 3 weeks ago." "What did it say?" Holmes's voice lowered slightly. "It suggested that certain deaths attributed to influenza displayed symptoms inconsistent with the disease." My pulse quickened. "They suspected poisoning?" Holmes inclined his head. "Not poisoning in the conventional sense, but they suspected that another cause might be masquerading as illness." "Then they were already investigating these deaths." "Exactly." Holmes resumed pacing. "Which brings us to a critical question, Watson. Which is, who knew about their investigation?" I considered the matter. "The committee members, certainly. And perhaps others," Holmes added quietly. He walked toward the desk and opened Blackwood's red ledger. "The chemist kept meticulous records of his experiments," he said. "But he also noted several personal observations." Holmes turned the pages until he found a particular entry. "Listen to this," he read aloud. "Symptoms of several recent deaths appear inconsistent with influenza progression. Possibility of chemical agent affecting respiratory system should be investigated further." Holmes closed the ledger. Blackwood had begun to suspect the same thing we are now considering. And Wright was gathering the medical data. "Precisely." A troubling thought occurred to me. If they were close to proving their theory. Holmes finished the sentence calmly. "Then someone had a powerful motive to stop them." The room fell silent for a moment. I looked again at the committee list. "How many others served with them?" Holmes counted quickly. 7. And any of them could have learned what the two men discovered. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "True." He returned to the map and placed 2 new marks near Marylebone. These represent additional deaths Wright had been studying before his own demise. I studied the pattern. The cluster had grown disturbingly dense. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if these are murders rather than disease, then we are witnessing only a fraction of the total number." He stepped back and regarded the map with grim concentration. "A clever murderer exploiting an epidemic would operate cautiously at first. A few deaths here and there, nothing sufficient to attract suspicion. But once the method proved effective, Holmes's voice grew colder. Then the opportunities would multiply. A faint chill passed through me. How many victims do you think there may be? Holmes remained silent for several seconds before answering. I suspect that by the time Blackwood and Wright began their investigation, the killer had already been active for several months. And now that they are dead? Holmes closed the ledger firmly. The investigation has fallen to us. He turned toward the window where the morning fog still drifted lazily along Baker Street. But there remains one difficulty. What is that? Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Blackwood and Wright both realized the truth. Yes, and both died soon afterward. A slow realization dawned upon me. You mean the killer may already know we are asking the same questions? Holmes gave a quiet nod. That possibility cannot be ignored. The thought cast a long shadow across the room, for if the murderer had indeed been watching the investigations of Blackwood and Wright, then the moment Holmes began following the same trail of clues, he too might have placed himself directly in the path of the most dangerous man in London. Later that afternoon, Holmes proposed that we pay another visit to the late Mr. Blackwood's establishment. The police had already completed their preliminary examination of the premises, yet Holmes maintained that there remained one individual whose testimony had not been fully explored. The assistant, he said, as we stepped into the fog-covered street, a man who spent many hours inside that laboratory. Such proximity to the victim's work must surely yield insight. The shop itself appeared much as we had left it 2 days earlier. The shutters were open once more, though the usual bustle of customers was absent. A single lamp burned behind the counter, illuminating rows of medicine bottles and small glass jars. Behind the counter stood the young assistant whom Inspector Bradstreet had previously mentioned. Peter Ashworth was a pale, narrow-faced man of perhaps 25, with dark hair that fell untidily across his forehead. When he recognized Holmes, his shoulders stiffened visibly. "Mr. Holmes," he said with forced politeness, "I had heard you were assisting the police." Holmes offered him a brief nod. "Merely satisfying my own curiosity, Mr. Ashworth. May we speak for a few moments?" The young man hesitated before gesturing toward the rear of the shop. "Of course." We followed him into a small office behind the counter. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and damp paper. Ashworth closed the door carefully, though I could not help noticing the nervous glance he cast toward the street before doing so. Holmes remained standing. "You discovered Mr. Blackwood's body, I believe?" "Yes." "Tell us again exactly how that occurred." Ashworth clasped his hands together. "I arrived early that morning as usual. When Mr. Blackwood did not answer my knock, I forced the laboratory door." Holmes regarded him quietly. "And the room was locked?" "Yes." "The windows secured?" "Yes." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And Mr. Blackwood had been working late the previous evening?" "That was not unusual," Ashworth replied quickly. "He spent most nights in the laboratory lately." Holmes's eyes flickered slightly. "Obsessed with his research?" "Very much so." Holmes walked slowly around the small office while Ashworth spoke. His gaze moved casually across the shelves and ledgers, though I knew well that nothing escaped his attention. "Did Mr. Blackwood ever express concern about his work?" Holmes asked. Ashworth's answer came a fraction too quickly. "No." Holmes paused beside a small writing desk. "No headaches? No strange sensations?" Ashworth shifted uneasily. "Well, he did complain of fatigue." "And nothing else?" The assistant hesitated. "Perhaps he mentioned feeling watched once or twice." "Watched?" Ashworth shrugged awkwardly. He said it jokingly, that someone might steal his discoveries. Holmes studied him closely. "Did he believe someone wished to harm him?" No, Ashworth said quickly. "Nothing like that." Holmes said nothing for several seconds. Then he moved toward the doorway and examined the corridor leading to the laboratory. "You had access to the laboratory yourself, I presume?" "Yes, of course." "And the chemical cabinet?" "Only Mr. Blackwood possessed the key." Holmes turned. "But you handled many of the materials used in his experiments." Ashworth nodded reluctantly. "Yes." Holmes returned to the center of the room and stopped directly before him. "Tell me, Mr. Ashworth, Did your employer receive visitors during the days preceding his death? The assistant blinked. A few customers, perhaps. Holmes shook his head gently. I refer to visitors who came specifically to discuss his research. Ashworth's eyes shifted toward the floor. I cannot recall any. Holmes remained silent. The stillness stretched long enough to make the young man visibly uncomfortable. You seem uncertain, Holmes said at last. I simply do not remember clearly. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Memory often improves when assisted by detail. Ashworth swallowed. Well, there was a gentleman who visited once. Holmes's expression sharpened. When? 2 days before Mr. Blackwood died. What did he want? Ashworth hesitated again. He said he represented a pharmaceutical company. And his name? I did not catch it. Holmes's voice remained calm. Did he spend long in the laboratory? Perhaps 20 minutes. And Mr. Blackwood allowed him access to the experiments. Ashworth shifted again. They spoke privately. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. Privately? Yes. Holmes studied the young man's face carefully. Did the conversation appear friendly? Ashworth's answer came slowly. Not entirely. How so? Mr. Blackwood seemed agitated afterward. Holmes straightened. And yet you did not mention this to the police. Ashworth flushed. It did not seem important. Holmes's gaze hardened slightly. On the contrary, Mr. Ashworth, in a case involving a man who died under mysterious circumstances, any unusual visitor becomes extremely important. The assistant's hands trembled faintly. I did not think it relevant. Holmes regarded him in silence. Then he spoke quietly. Tell me something else. Yes? Did this visitor return after Mr. Blackwood's death? Ashworth's eyes widened. No. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. That is fortunate. Why? Holmes turned toward the door. Because if he had returned, Holmes said calmly, it might have suggested that Mr. Blackwood's experiments were of interest to someone beyond the medical community. Ashworth said nothing. Holmes stepped into the corridor and glanced toward the laboratory stairs before turning back toward the young man. Mr. Ashworth, he said quietly, should you remember anything further about this visitor, I advise you to inform Inspector Bradstreet immediately. Ashworth nodded nervously. Yes, Mr. Holmes. As we stepped back into the foggy street, I turned toward my friend. You suspect him, I said. Holmes shook his head slowly. Not necessarily, but something troubled you. Holmes glanced back toward the shop window. Yes, what? Holmes's voice lowered slightly. Mr. Ashworth is afraid of being accused. Holmes shook his head again. No, Watson. Then of what? Holmes's eyes lingered upon the dim interior of the shop. I suspect he fears someone far more dangerous than the police. The following day, Holmes insisted that our inquiries take a direction which at first seemed curiously distant from the chemical mysteries that had occupied his thoughts thus far. Instead of returning to Blackwood's laboratory or consulting with physicians regarding the epidemic, he proposed that we visit Somerset House to examine a series of probate records. You appear to be abandoning chemistry for law, Holmes, I observed, as our cab carried us through the grey morning streets. On the contrary, Watson, Holmes replied calmly, I am merely pursuing the one constant factor in nearly every crime ever committed, and that is human greed. Somerset House presented its usual atmosphere of dusty bureaucracy and quiet industry. Clerks moved methodically through the long reading rooms, while lawyers and executors consulted thick ledgers containing the legal destinies of London's dead. Holmes seemed entirely at ease in this environment, as though navigating such records were as natural to him as examining footprints upon a muddy road. He produced a small list of names from his pocket. These individuals, he explained quietly, all died of influenza within the past 3 months. I scanned the list. Some names were familiar from the newspaper notices Holmes had been studying. Others I had not seen before. Why these particular cases? Holmes lowered his voice slightly. Because they all share one important feature. He handed the list to a clerk and requested access to the corresponding probate documents. Within a short time, we were seated at a long wooden table surrounded by thick leather-bound registers. Holmes opened the first volume and began reading with swift concentration. After several minutes, he gave a faint sound of satisfaction. As I suspected. What have you found? Holmes turned the register toward me. This gentleman, Mr. Harold Pembroke, died suddenly 6 weeks ago. I examined the entry. Influenza complications. Indeed. Holmes pointed to the next column. Now observe the date of his final will. I frowned. It was changed only 3 days before his death. Holmes nodded. And the beneficiary? I read the name aloud. The Westmoreland Charitable Trust. Holmes smiled faintly. Let us examine another. He opened a second ledger. Mrs. Caroline Hensley, died last month. I followed the entry. Also influenza, and her will changed 1 week before death. The beneficiary? The same charitable trust. Holmes leaned back slightly in his chair. You see the pattern emerging. I felt a stir of unease. These people all redirected their estates to the same organization shortly before dying. Precisely. Holmes closed the ledger and opened another. And if we continue examining the remaining cases, I suspect we shall discover the same arrangement repeated. The next several records confirmed his suspicion with unsettling consistency. In case after case, the victims had altered their wills only days or weeks before death, transferring substantial estates to various charitable foundations or intermediary beneficiaries. Yet Holmes's interest centered not upon the charities themselves, but upon another detail entirely. He tapped a particular line within the probate document. Observe the witnesses. Each will had been validated by the same legal clerk, a man named Percival Aldridge. Holmes wrote the name carefully into his notebook. A curious coincidence, he murmured. You believe Aldridge forged the wills? Holmes shook his head. Forgery would require unnecessary risk. Then what? Holmes leaned forward slightly. A far more elegant arrangement. He pointed again to the entry. Aldridge serves as the legal witness verifying the authenticity of these documents, which gives him access to the entire process. Exactly. Holmes folded his hands thoughtfully. Imagine a man who befriends wealthy individuals, particularly those with few close relatives. He persuades them to revise their wills in favor of charitable organizations under his influence. And then they die shortly afterward. Holmes nodded slowly. In a city gripped by epidemic, such deaths would attract little suspicion. A slow chill crept through me. You mean these people were murdered for their inheritances? Holmes's expression hardened. That is the inevitable conclusion. But Holmes, I said quietly, how could Aldridge possibly administer poison without being present? Holmes closed the ledger gently. That question brings us back to Blackwood's compound. The realization struck me immediately. The invisible vapor. Holmes inclined his head. A chemical agent capable of producing death while leaving minimal evidence. And the epidemic provides perfect cover. Holmes rose from his chair and began pacing slowly along the length of the table. The scheme is devilishly simple, he continued. Once the wills are secured, the victim is exposed to the compound through some seemingly harmless object, tea, medicine, perhaps even a heating lamp. And the death appears natural. Exactly. Holmes stopped and looked down at the stack of records. These probate files represent only the cases we have identified thus far. You think there are more? Holmes's voice grew quiet. Almost certainly. He slipped the notebook back into his coat pocket. For several months, this man has been selecting victims with careful precision. And Blackwood discovered the pattern. Yes. And Dr. Wright was gathering the medical evidence. Holmes nodded gravely. Which explains why both men died. We left Somerset House shortly afterward, the fog still drifting heavily across the Thames embankment. As our cab carried us back toward Baker Street, I studied Holmes's thoughtful expression. If this Aldridge is truly responsible, I said, then we are dealing with a murderer who has already claimed many victims. Holmes gazed out through the fog-covered window. Yes, Watson, and he may continue killing. Holmes turned slowly toward me. Unless we discover his next intended victim before he does. The cab wheels rattled softly over the wet cobblestones as we drove back through the mist. For the first time since the investigation had begun, the shape of the crime had emerged with terrible clarity. The epidemic spreading through London was not merely a natural disaster, it had become the perfect disguise for murder. Our return to Baker Street that evening was accompanied by a silence more thoughtful than weary. Holmes spoke very little during the cab ride, yet the intensity of his expression suggested that his mind had already moved several steps ahead of the discoveries we had made at Somerset House. Once inside the familiar sitting room, he removed his coat and immediately began arranging the newly acquired probate records upon the table beside the map of the district. The lamplight cast long shadows across the papers as Holmes studied them with quiet satisfaction. "You perceive the elegance of the scheme now, Watson," he said at last. "I perceive its brutality," I replied. Holmes nodded slightly. "Yes, but brutality alone does not explain its success. What makes this crime remarkable is its simplicity." He lifted one of the probate records and tapped the page with his finger. "Aldridge does not forge wills, which would attract suspicion. Instead, he persuades his victims to sign them willingly, and then murders them afterward." Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." I leaned forward in my chair. "But how does he ensure they die at the correct moment? Surely he cannot predict the exact time the poison takes effect." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Ah, but that is the advantage of using a volatile compound." He retrieved the small vial taken from Blackwood's laboratory and held it carefully beneath the lamp. "A chemical that releases vapor upon contact with heat or air allows for remarkable flexibility. You mean the poison could be administered hours before death?" "Exactly." Holmes set the vial down and began pacing slowly across the carpet. "Consider the circumstances surrounding the deaths we have examined. In several cases, the victims were last seen alone shortly after taking tea or medicine." I felt a sudden realization. The poison could be placed in the tea itself. "Or in the teapot," Holmes added. The thought was chilling in its simplicity. When the water is poured, the compound heats and vaporizes, and the victim inhales it while drinking. Holmes nodded. Within minutes, the vapor would produce dizziness, respiratory distress, and eventually unconsciousness. To an attending physician, it would resemble influenza. Precisely. Holmes stopped beside the window and gazed into the fog drifting along Baker Street. "London's physicians are currently overwhelmed with epidemic cases. They expect to see respiratory failure, fever, and weakness. So they do not question it." Holmes turned toward me again. "Nor would they have reason to. A volatile compound leaves little residue once dispersed." I considered the victims we had identified. "The wills ensure Aldridge receives the inheritance through charitable intermediaries under his control," Holmes said, "and the epidemic ensures the deaths attract no investigation." Holmes's expression grew grave. "It is a criminal scheme of remarkable efficiency." For several moments, neither of us spoke. The quiet ticking of the clock upon the mantelpiece seemed unusually loud in the stillness. "At least 15 deaths," I said slowly. Holmes nodded. "And possibly more. You believe Aldridge has been operating for months?" "Very likely." Holmes returned to the table and examined the map once more. "What makes the scheme particularly dangerous," he continued, "is that it requires no accomplice to administer the poison at the moment of death. He prepares the compound earlier." "Exactly." Holmes tapped several points on the map. "Aldridge visits his intended victims under some respectable pretense, legal consultation, charitable representation, perhaps even medical advice. And during the visit, he places the compound somewhere it will later release its vapor." Holmes gave a slight nod. "A teapot, a warming lamp, perhaps even a medicine bottle. And once the victim activates the object, the poison does the rest." The simplicity of the method was almost unbearable. "But Holmes," I said suddenly, "what about the visitor Ashworth mentioned?" Holmes's eyes brightened faintly. "The supposed pharmaceutical representative." "Yes." Holmes walked slowly toward the fireplace. "That detail is most interesting. You believe it was Aldridge himself?" "Possibly," Holmes replied, "or perhaps one of his agents." "But why visit Blackwood?" Holmes's voice dropped slightly. "Because Blackwood had begun to suspect the truth. I remembered the chemist's laboratory notes. He believed some epidemic deaths were actually poisoning cases." "Precisely." Holmes folded his hands behind his back. and Dr. Wright was gathering the medical evidence necessary to prove it. So Aldridge eliminated them. Holmes inclined his head, in precisely the same manner as his other victims. I felt a sudden unease. Holmes, if this man realized they were investigating him, yes, then he might already know that we are doing the same. Holmes regarded me thoughtfully. That possibility cannot be ignored. The fog outside thickened again, pressing softly against the window glass. Holmes returned his attention to the map and studied the cluster of deaths around Baker Street. "There remains one final question," he said quietly. "What is that?" Holmes tapped the map with his pencil. "Who is Aldridge planning to kill next?" The implication settled heavily in the room. For if the murderer continued operating as Holmes suspected, somewhere in London another victim had already signed a will and unknowingly prepared the instrument of his own death. Holmes straightened slowly. "Which means," he said, "that our investigation has now entered its most dangerous stage." "And that is," Holmes's voice carried a quiet certainty, "we must catch the killer before the epidemic claims another victim who never had influenza at all." Holmes slept little that night. I know this not merely because the light from our sitting room burned long past midnight, but because each time I rose from uneasy sleep, I heard the faint movement of his footsteps upon the floorboards above. When morning finally arrived, grey and damp as ever beneath the lingering fog, I descended to find him seated at the breakfast table with several letters already written and sealed. "You appear to have spent the night constructing a campaign," I remarked. Holmes glanced up with a faint smile. "Only the opening movement, Watson. And the enemy?" Holmes gestured toward the map still pinned upon the wall. "A man who has used panic, illness, and human trust to conceal his crimes for months. Such an adversary must be approached with care." He slid one of the letters toward me. "This is for Inspector Bradstreet." I read the brief note. Holmes requested discreet surveillance of several addresses in the Marylebone district. "You believe Aldridge has already selected his next victim," I said. Holmes nodded. "I am certain of it. And how do you propose we identify the unfortunate person?" Holmes rose and crossed to the map. With the assistance of Aldridge's own habits, he tapped one of the newly marked addresses. "Mr. Leonard Fairley, a retired importer of considerable wealth. What of him? 3 weeks ago he revised his will in favor of one of Aldridge's charities?" "Exactly." Holmes turned toward me. "Furthermore, Fairley lives alone save for a single elderly housekeeper, and he resides within the same district as our previous victims." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "The pattern remains consistent." I felt a growing unease. "You believe Aldridge intends to kill him soon?" Holmes nodded gravely. "Within days, if not sooner." "And your plan?" Holmes returned to the table and began spreading several documents before me. "Inspector Bradstreet will place plainclothes officers near Fairley's residence, and we," Holmes's voice lowered slightly, "we shall observe. You intend to wait for the murderer to strike." Holmes met my gaze calmly. "It is the only way to secure evidence strong enough to expose the entire conspiracy." The logic of the plan was undeniable, yet something in it troubled me. "You realize what you are proposing, Holmes?" "Yes." "You are using this man as bait." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "Watson, Aldridge has already murdered at least 15 people. I know, if we fail to stop him now, there will be more." His words carried the grim certainty of mathematics rather than speculation. "And you believe Fairley is already marked?" Holmes nodded. "If we intervene too early, Aldridge will simply choose another victim. But if we wait, we catch him in the act." The room fell silent. At last I exhaled slowly. "You never choose the easy path, Holmes." Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. "The easy path rarely leads to justice." By mid-afternoon we were traveling toward Marylebone in a discreet hired cab. Inspector Bradstreet joined us shortly afterward, his expression revealing a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You're certain this Fairley fellow is the next target?" he asked. Holmes studied the quiet residential street ahead. "As certain as one can be without consulting the murderer himself." Fairley's house stood midway along a row of respectable townhouses, its brick facade dimly lit beneath the fog-filtered daylight. The windows appeared ordinary enough, yet Holmes examined them with the careful scrutiny of a general studying enemy fortifications. "Housekeeper?" Bradstreet asked. "Present," Holmes replied. "She has been instructed not to disturb her employer's evening routine." And Fairley himself, unaware of our suspicions. Bradstreet shifted uneasily. "That man may be in serious danger tonight." Holmes's voice remained steady. "Which is why we must remain vigilant." As dusk approached, the fog thickened once again across the district. Gas lamps flickered to life along the pavement, casting pale circles of light that seemed barely strong enough to penetrate the mist. Holmes positioned himself at the window of the small rented room we had secured opposite Fairley's residence. From there, we could observe the front entrance clearly. Bradstreet stationed 2 officers farther down the street where they could intercept any suspicious visitor attempting to depart. The hours passed slowly. 7 o'clock, 8. At 8:30, the housekeeper was seen leaving the residence briefly to purchase supplies from a nearby shop. Fairley remained inside. Holmes watched the street without moving. "You expect Aldridge himself," Bradstreet whispered. "Possibly," Holmes replied. "And if he sends someone else?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon the foggy pavement. "Then we shall learn the face of another conspirator." 9 o'clock approached. The street had grown nearly deserted when a solitary figure emerged from the fog at the far end of the road. He walked with measured confidence, carrying a small leather case beneath one arm. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What do you see?" I asked quietly. Holmes did not look away from the window. "A gentleman," he murmured. Bradstreet leaned closer. "Do you recognize him?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet." The man approached Fairley's door and knocked. Moments later the door opened and the visitor was admitted. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "Now we shall discover whether our reasoning has been correct." And somewhere within that quiet house, perhaps even at that moment, the mechanism of Aldridge's deadly design had begun to unfold once again. The door of Mr. Fairley's residence closed quietly behind the visitor, and for several moments none of us spoke. Holmes remained perfectly still at the window, his tall frame outlined by the lamplight behind him. Outside, the fog drifted slowly along the street, swallowing the figure of the man who had just entered the house as completely as if he had vanished into smoke. Inspector Bradstreet shifted uneasily beside me. "You believe that's him?" he whispered. Holmes did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed upon the darkened doorway across the street. "I believe," he said at last, "that our visitor possesses a purpose. And if it is the one you suspect," Holmes's voice lowered slightly, "then we must be prepared to act quickly." The minutes that followed passed with an oppressive slowness. From our vantage point, we could see only the faint glow of lamps through the curtains of Fairley's drawing room. Occasionally, the shadows of 2 figures crossed the window, one moving with the measured calm of the visitor, the other with the slower motions of the elderly homeowner. Bradstreet rubbed his hands together nervously. What could he be doing in there? Holmes answered without turning. "Establishing trust." "Trust?" "Yes. Aldridge's success depends upon appearing respectable. He must ensure his victims feel no alarm." Bradstreet frowned. "Why visit at night?" "Because illness often requires evening consultations," Holmes replied, "particularly during an epidemic." The explanation seemed grimly plausible. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Holmes remained motionless, though I could sense the tension building beneath his calm exterior. At last he spoke. "Look there." A faint movement appeared behind the curtains. The visitor had risen from his chair and was now moving toward the small table near the fireplace where a tea service rested. Bradstreet leaned closer to the window. "What is he doing?" Holmes's voice grew quiet. "Preparing the instrument of death." The visitor lifted the teapot and appeared to examine it briefly. Then he opened his leather case. Though the fog and curtains obscured our view, I could see him remove a small glass vial. My heart quickened. "He's adding something," I whispered. Holmes nodded. Exactly as I anticipated. Bradstreet's face hardened. "Then we move now." Holmes raised a hand sharply. "Not yet." Bradstreet stared at him. "Holmes, the man could kill him any moment, which is precisely why we must observe the final step." Across the street, the visitor carefully replaced the vial inside his case. He then poured hot water into the teapot and returned calmly to his seat. Within seconds, thin vapor began rising from the spout. Holmes exhaled softly. There it is. Bradstreet's patience snapped. That's enough for me. He turned toward the door. Holmes spoke sharply. Now. In the next instant, we were already racing down the narrow staircase and out into the fog-filled street. Bradstreet signaled the two officers stationed nearby, and together we crossed the road with swift urgency. The front door of Fairley's house opened before we could knock. The elderly housekeeper stood there, startled by the sudden commotion. "Inspector?" she stammered. Bradstreet stepped inside immediately. "Where is Mr. Fairley?" "In the drawing-room with a gentleman." Holmes had already moved past her. We entered the room just as Mr. Fairley lifted the teacup to his lips. "Do not drink that," Holmes shouted. The elderly man froze in surprise. The visitor rose slowly from his chair. For the first time I saw his face clearly. He was a tall man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair and a calm expression that showed neither panic nor anger. Only calculation. Holmes stepped forward. "Good evening, Mr. Aldridge." The man regarded him coolly. "I'm afraid you have the advantage of me." Inspector Bradstreet moved beside Holmes. "You're under arrest." Aldridge glanced briefly at the teapot. "For what offense?" Holmes gestured toward the rising vapor. "For murder." Aldridge smiled faintly. "Surely you exaggerate." Holmes lifted the teapot lid slightly and inhaled cautiously. The same volatile compound found in Mr. Blackwood's laboratory. Aldridge's eyes flickered for the first time. "Your evidence appears rather circumstantial." Bradstreet stepped forward. "Save it for the magistrate." Two constables moved in from the doorway. Yet Aldridge remained perfectly composed. "You have misunderstood the situation entirely," he said calmly. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Have we?" "Yes." Aldridge's eyes moved briefly toward the leather case on the table. Before anyone could react, he lunged toward it. But Holmes was faster. With a swift motion, he knocked the case aside and seized Aldridge's wrist. The small glass vial fell to the floor and shattered. A sharp, sweet odor filled the room instantly. Holmes forced Aldridge backward toward the open window. "Open it!" he shouted. Bradstreet flung the window upward just as the vapor began to spread. Cold night air rushed into the room, dispersing the fumes. Aldridge struggled briefly before the constable secured his arms. Mr. Fairley sank into his chair, pale and trembling. Holmes released the prisoner and stepped back. "For a man who relied upon invisible weapons," Holmes said quietly, "you were remarkably careless about carrying the evidence." Aldridge's calm mask had finally cracked. His eyes burned with cold fury. "You think you have won?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "I know we have, and for the first time since the epidemic had begun its silent spread across London." The architect of those hidden deaths stood exposed beneath the lamplight of Baker Street justice. The drawing-room fell into a strained silence once the struggle ended. Inspector Bradstreet's constables held Percival Aldridge firmly by the arms, though the prisoner himself seemed in little danger of resistance. The brief flash of violence had passed from him as swiftly as it had appeared. He stood upright once more, adjusting his cuffs with a composure that might have belonged to a gentleman awaiting a carriage rather than a murderer caught in the act. Mr. Fairley remained seated heavily in his chair, pale and shaken, the untouched teacup still trembling in his hand. Holmes crossed the room slowly and lifted the teapot from the small table. The faint vapor still rose from its spout, though the open window had already begun to disperse the poisonous fumes. He turned toward Aldridge. "You see, Mr. Aldridge," Holmes said quietly, "your method possesses a certain elegance. A chemical compound invisible to the eye dispersed through heated liquid, leaving symptoms easily mistaken for disease." Aldridge's expression hardened. "I have no idea what you are implying." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I believe you understand perfectly." Bradstreet stepped forward. "We caught you poisoning this man." Aldridge's voice remained smooth. "You caught me preparing tea." Holmes set the teapot down carefully. with a volatile compound stolen from the laboratory of the late Theodore Blackwood. For the first time, Aldridge's composure faltered slightly. "You cannot prove that." Holmes gestured toward the shattered vial on the carpet. "The chemical residue will suffice," Bradstreet added grimly, "and your presence at the homes of several previous victims." Aldridge's eyes flickered briefly. "You have been very busy, Mr. Holmes." Holmes inclined his head. "Busy enough to recognize the structure of your scheme." He walked slowly across the room, hands clasped behind his back. "For months you have been selecting wealthy individuals, particularly those without close heirs. You cultivated their trust, often under the guise of charitable consultation." Aldridge said nothing. Holmes continued. "You persuaded them to revise their wills in favor of certain charitable organizations." Mr. Fairley looked up suddenly. "The same charities your office recommended to me." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." He stopped directly before Aldridge. "These organizations are merely intermediaries through which the estates eventually return to you." Bradstreet's expression darkened. "You've been murdering people for their inheritance." Holmes raised a finger slightly. "More precisely, Inspector, he has been allowing the epidemic to conceal his murders." Aldridge's lips tightened. Holmes resumed pacing. "Once the will was secured, the victim needed only to encounter your invisible weapon. A small vial placed discreetly within a teapot, a medicine bottle, or perhaps a warming lamp." Holmes gestured toward the teapot beside Mr. Fairley. The heat released the vapor. "Watson, that is," I spoke quietly. "And the victim inhaled the poison while believing he was drinking tea." Holmes nodded. "The resulting symptoms resembled influenza closely enough that physicians attributed the death to the epidemic." Bradstreet shook his head in disbelief. "And we never questioned it." Holmes turned toward him. "Because London expected people to die of influenza." The inspector looked again at Aldridge. "How many?" Holmes answered calmly. "At least 15 confirmed cases." Aldridge laughed softly. "You flatter me." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Your modesty is unnecessary." Blackwood had already begun documenting the pattern. The name caused Aldridge's expression to darken. "Yes," he said quietly. "The chemist." Holmes nodded. He realized that certain epidemic deaths shared unusual characteristics. Respiratory collapse without fever, victims discovered alone in sealed rooms. And he began investigating. Holmes inclined his head. "Which made him a problem." Aldridge's voice grew colder. "He should have left the matter alone." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "So you visited his laboratory under the pretense of pharmaceutical consultation?" Aldridge remained silent. Holmes continued, "You obtained samples of his compound, perhaps through his assistant." The prisoner's eyes shifted briefly. "Peter Ashworth," Holmes added quietly, "a frightened young man who realized too late what he had helped create." Aldridge's composure finally cracked. "He was weak." Holmes nodded. "Indeed." Bradstreet leaned forward. "You killed Blackwood." Aldridge's voice became sharp. "He forced my hand." Holmes spoke calmly. "And Dr. Wright?" Aldridge looked toward the floor. The physician was more persistent than the chemist. "You silenced him as well?" "Yes." The confession hung heavily in the room. Bradstreet's voice hardened. "And all the others?" Aldridge lifted his head slowly. "They were merely opportunities." Mr. Fairley stared at him in horror. "You would have killed me tonight." Aldridge's expression returned to its earlier cold calm. "You had already signed the will." Holmes stepped closer. "You see, Inspector," he said quietly, "Aldridge did not create the epidemic." Bradstreet frowned. "Then why call the case the Baker Street epidemic?" Holmes's eyes moved toward the fog drifting through the open window. "Because Aldridge discovered that an epidemic is the perfect disguise for murder." The room fell silent once more. Outside, London continued its anxious battle with disease, unaware that many of the deaths attributed to illness had in fact been deliberate acts of calculated greed. Holmes looked back at Aldridge. "For months you hid behind the fog of panic." Aldridge gave a thin smile. "And yet here I stand." Holmes nodded calmly. "Yes." Bradstreet stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the prisoner's shoulder. And now you'll stand before a judge." Aldridge's smile vanished. The constables led him toward the door. As he passed Holmes, he paused briefly. "You are an impressive adversary, Mr. Holmes." Holmes regarded him without emotion. "You are a predictable criminal." Aldridge said nothing more. Moments later, the door closed behind him, and the quiet drawing room seemed suddenly lighter, as though some invisible weight had lifted from the air. Yet I knew that Holmes's mind was already moving toward the final task that remained. For the case of the Baker Street epidemic was not yet fully explained, and Holmes would never consider his work complete until every detail of the crime had been placed in its proper order. The fog had begun to lift by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in the early hours of the morning. A faint glow from the approaching dawn filtered through the thinning mist, casting a pale silver light along the quiet street. The city seemed strangely calm after the tension of the evening, as though London itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray upon the table, tea, toast, and a small pot of marmalade, though neither Holmes nor I touched it immediately. The events of the night had left us both thoughtful, and for several minutes Holmes stood by the window, his long silhouette outlined against the first pale light of morning. At last I broke the silence. "You anticipated nearly every step of Aldridge's plan," I said. Holmes turned slightly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Only because his scheme relied upon a pattern, Watson, and patterns, once identified, tend to betray themselves." I settled into the armchair opposite him. "You suspected the truth even before we discovered the probate records?" Holmes nodded. "The moment I examined Blackwood's laboratory, I realized we were dealing with something beyond a natural death. The vapor." "Precisely." Holmes moved toward the table and lifted the small vial that remained from Blackwood's experiments. "The compound itself was ingenious," he continued. "A mixture capable of releasing a toxic gas when heated. Blackwood likely developed it during his search for a treatment to neutralize airborne infection, and Aldridge turned it into a weapon." Holmes inclined his head. "A weapon perfectly suited to the chaos of an epidemic." I leaned forward. "What first convinced you the deaths were deliberate?" Holmes placed the vial down carefully. "The expressions upon the victims' faces." "That detail again." Holmes nodded. "Influenza can produce fever, weakness, and delirium, but it rarely produces sudden terror. The look described in the newspaper reports suggested a violent reaction occurring in the final moments. The moment the vapor was inhaled." "Exactly." Holmes resumed pacing slowly across the room. "But the true brilliance of Aldridge's plan lay not in the chemical itself. In the epidemic." Holmes stopped beside the map still hanging upon the wall. "Yes, an epidemic provides a criminal with an extraordinary advantage." "How so?" Holmes gestured toward the cluster of marks surrounding Baker Street. "When disease spreads through a city, physicians expect to see sudden deaths. Families accept them, authorities record them without question, and the murderer disappears within the statistics." Holmes nodded quietly. Aldridge merely added his own victims to the list. The simplicity of the idea was deeply unsettling. "And the wills ensured he profited from each death." Holmes smiled faintly. "That element was almost traditional. Murder for inheritance is one of the oldest crimes in human history. But his method made it nearly impossible to detect." "Nearly," Holmes corrected gently. "I considered the sequence of events. Blackwood discovered the pattern first." "Yes." "And Dr. Wright gathered the medical evidence." Holmes nodded. Aldridge realized the danger once their investigation began. So he silenced them. Holmes's expression grew grave. "The chemist died in his laboratory when Aldridge introduced the compound into his work. Wright died when the poison was placed within his teapot." I shuddered slightly. "And all the others?" Holmes returned to the fireplace and lit his pipe. "They were simply convenient opportunities." Smoke drifted slowly through the room as Holmes sank into his chair. For several months, Aldridge selected victims with careful precision. Wealthy individuals, often elderly, living alone. He befriended them, convinced them to revise their wills, and then arranged their deaths. And London believed the epidemic had claimed them. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke. which allowed him to continue indefinitely. The quiet ticking of the clock filled the room. "How many do you believe he killed?" I asked. Holmes considered for a moment. 15 confirmed, perhaps several more we may never identify. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. "All hidden beneath the same epidemic." Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes." He rose once more and moved toward the window. Outside, the fog had almost entirely cleared. The early morning sun was beginning to illuminate the rooftops of Baker Street, casting the familiar buildings in a fresh golden light. London was awakening again. Holmes watched the street thoughtfully. "Criminals often believe themselves invisible when they exploit society's weaknesses," he said quietly. And Aldridge exploited fear. Fear, confusion, and the assumption that illness must always be natural. Holmes turned toward me, "But every deception eventually reveals a pattern. And you saw it." Holmes gave a modest shrug. "Blackwood saw it first. His notes provided the foundation for the investigation." I reached for my notebook. "Then the world should know the truth." Holmes raised a hand quickly. "Not entirely." "No?" Holmes shook his head. "The chemical details must remain vague. You fear imitation." "Precisely." He gestured toward the map once more. "The lesson of this case is not the poison itself, but the danger of unquestioned assumptions." I nodded slowly. "Deaths attributed to disease should still be examined carefully." Holmes smiled faintly. "Just so." The morning sunlight now filled the room completely, replacing the gloom of the fog that had haunted Baker Street for so many days. I closed my notebook thoughtfully. "And what shall we call the case?" Holmes considered for a moment before answering. "The secret behind the Baker Street epidemic." He moved back toward his chair and picked up the morning newspaper that had just been delivered. Outside, the city resumed its ordinary rhythm. Carriages rattling along the street, shopkeepers opening their doors, and citizens beginning another day unaware of how close they had come to becoming victims of an invisible killer. Holmes glanced at the headlines briefly before folding the paper aside. "Well, Watson," he said calmly, "I suspect London will continue to produce mysteries long after this epidemic fades from memory." And with that quiet remark, the case was finished, though its lessons would remain with me long after the fog had vanished from Baker Street.